Have you ever had an amazing experience and been certain that you would always remember it? But then years or months or even weeks later, you realized that the memory had faded and you'd forgotten details. Joseph Smith had hundreds of amazing spiritual experiences, revelations that he received from heaven, and he knew it was essential that these things be written down. That is how the Doctrine and Covenants came to be. But before this book could be published to the world, it needed a preface or introduction. And four of the smartest church members were put in charge of that job. But they failed miserably. Who were these authors and why did they fail and how did they finally create a preface? That's exactly what we're going to learn about today. Let's dive into it. Doctrine and Covenants 1. The Book of Mormon was published and the Church of Christ was formally organized in 1830. It was a great year. After these events, Joseph Smith, the prophet, received a revelation that all the members of the church should be gathered together in one place. This would have been important during a time when communication was somewhat difficult and physical safety wasn't guaranteed for members of the church. Joseph may have been thinking that New York, the place where he'd received the first vision and unearthed the gold plates, would be a holy place of gathering. But he then received a second revelation. This revelation made it clear that the church was to build up a city, a new Jerusalem, but that it was to be among the Lamanites. The physical landscape of America at that time was such that New York was just about as far away as you could get from the Lamanites, or American Indians, who lived just west of Missouri. Wanting to understand more and begin this work immediately, Joseph sent a group of 4 missionaries west to preach the gospel to the American Indians on the line between Missouri and Native American territory. These 4 missionaries were Peter Whitmer Jr., Oliver Cowdery, Parley P. Pratt, and Ziba Peterson. Though their aim was Missouri, these men stopped and taught the gospel as they traveled, and much to their delight, they found an open and willing audience in the area in and around Kirtland, Ohio. Near Kirtland, Parley P. Pratt met with his former minister, Sidney Rigdon, to share the gospel and a copy of the Book of Mormon with him. Sidney was a former tanner and farmer and minister born in Pennsylvania. And when he met these missionaries, he was actually presiding over a Christian congregation in Ohio. He and his wife knew they would lose the home their church gave them if they converted to a new faith. But Sidney was ready for the restoration, and he and his wife listened when these missionaries came. After some time, he requested to be baptized and even encouraged his congregation to give serious consideration to what the missionaries said. It truly is so impressive. Sidney was giving up his livelihood and his power over his congregation. The effect of Sidney's example and words was powerful. Parley P. Pratt said that he and the other missionaries were, quote, thronged night and day, insomuch that we had no time for rest and retirement. The missionaries remained in the area for about 3 weeks, during which time they baptized an estimated 127 people, doubling the church's membership. What a mission. Shortly after his baptism, Sidney Rigdon traveled to New York to meet the prophet Joseph. He, along with Edward Partridge, made the trip to New York, where Sidney stayed with Joseph for 2 months. And Sidney served as a scribe and a support to Joseph as he worked on the revised translation of the Bible. While Sidney was in New York, Joseph received a revelation that the saints were to move to Ohio, and that it was to be the gathering place of the church. Just 2 months later, Joseph and Emma moved to Ohio, and by May 1831, the majority of church members lived in and around Kirtland, Ohio, some at great sacrifice in having to make the move. These gathered saints wanted to continue spreading the gospel, and as I mentioned previously, Joseph wanted to keep a record of all the revelations he was receiving. The perfect solution was to compile those revelations into a book they called the Book of Commandments, but what we now call the Doctrine and Covenants. However, leaders within the church wanted the book to have a preface that would explain what these revelations were about, which makes sense because the church was relatively new, and if this book was to be used in missionary efforts, it would be helpful to have a preface explaining what it was and why the book existed. So the very best writers in the church were formed into a committee to write the preface to the Book of Commandments. Sidney Rigdon, the famous preacher who was a recent convert, Oliver Cowdery, the former schoolteacher who had helped Joseph Smith as a scribe while he translated the Book of Mormon, William E. McClellan, also an experienced schoolteacher. These men were powerful and confident speakers, writers, and preachers of the gospel, and they went to work. Together they labored over, and I'm sure prayed over, what the words to this important preface would be. And on November 1st, 1831, on the first day of a 2-day conference of church elders in Hiram, Ohio, they presented it for approval. Though the preface was undoubtedly well written, the elders in attendance at the conference picked it to pieces, but also couldn't agree on how it should be changed. The debate continued until a break was called so that the men could eat and refresh themselves before the conference continued in the afternoon. When the break was called, the elders asked Joseph Smith to inquire of the Lord as to what they should do about the preface. Joseph, who sat by a window, bowed his head along with the other men and began to earnestly pray. As he prayed, he received words of revelation that he spoke out loud. Sidney Rigdon, who sat nearby, acted as scribe, writing down what Joseph said and then repeating it back to check if he'd gotten it right. If he had, Joseph would continue the dictation until finally the revelation ended and the preface to the Book of Commandments was complete. The men in attendance at the conference, who had all seen this marvelous revelation take place, signed a document testifying that the preface and the book it would be attached to were, quote, given by inspiration of God and are profitable for all men. So what did the Lord say in the preface to the Book of Commandments, or what we now call the Doctrine and Covenants? There are 7 topics covered, but the first and last seem to deserve a little extra focus. First, the Lord's voice and that of his Latter-day servants is to all people. This book is for everyone, not just members of the church, not just those who naturally enjoy church history. All of us need to study it. And last, all of the Lord's words will be fulfilled. Whether he has spoken them himself or speaks them through his prophet, it's the same. This is a reminder that we need to pay close attention to what the Doctrine and Covenants says and what modern-day prophets say, because it's as if the Lord is speaking. So what is the lesson from Doctrine and Covenants 1? I think it's that this book matters and that it's for all of us. It is filled with the Lord's words and the words of his servant Joseph, and those words matter because they will be fulfilled, whether we're familiar with them or not. In that spirit, this year, let's pay special attention to what the Doctrine and Covenants calls us to do and then take action. If you want help with your daily scripture study, make sure to check out the show notes where there is a link to my membership, which includes daily texts, daily prompts, and study options for every member of the family.